Hello, class. This PowerPoint is meant to help you work through some ideas regarding revisionist Westerns. Hopefully you've watched a revisionist Western or two, and this PowerPoint presentation will just help you bring together some ideas related to these films. Let's begin with a short review of the myth of the West, which we've pretty much been talking about throughout this class. Let's go all the way back to Richard White, who talked about the imagined West, who described how public Wests, or what we imagine the American West to be, and the mythic West, as well as the actual historic West, what really happened, are all kind of in conversation. There's a dialogue happening between all of them. And we need to remember that myths, when we talk about the myth of the West or the myth of the Texas Rangers, they're not falsehoods, but explanations. Stories that tell us why people and things are what they are. Once again, this is an important quote from Richard Slotkin. Modern myths are stories drawn from history that have acquired through usage and through generations a symbolizing function central to the society that produces them. Myths give meaning to our world. They're deeply encoded sets of metaphors that contain lessons from history and essential to understanding a culture's worldview. So what we have talked about in this class is very much in line with classic Westerns or classic Western mythologies. When we talk about classic Westerns, we generally find a few features that comprise the classic Western. And again, these are general ideas. The emphasis on a landscape. Very early on, we read Jane Tompkins' chapter on landscape. And if you recall, the landscape in these early classic Westerns very often mirrors the hero of these stories. Action and adventure are at the core of these stories, so are cultural clashes. And those cultural clashes generally involve the clash between the traditional cowboy image and the Native American. Very often, or usually, we have a hero who champions good, who fights the so-called evil forces of the landscape, again, generally Native Americans, and very often deplores the loss of that pristine wilderness. Women are very often absent or are given minor roles. And Richard White also talks about how we do not only get many of our traditional ideas about the West from films, but we also, when we view these classic Westerns, imagine the landscape to be empty and vast and not necessarily filled with earlier cultures. Now, as we begin to complicate things, which is what we did this week, by understanding a little more about the people and especially the heroes who populate these stories, it's kind of important to look at the shift. And someone who writes about this shift or who has written about this shift very eloquently is Larry McMurtry. He's from Archer City, which is very close to Lubbock, and he really helped popularize as well as problematize the vision of the Texas Rangers in his Lonesome Dove series. And here's a quote of McMurtry's. Here and there, scattered through the works of Dobie, Webb, and Bedichek. Again, these are major historians that we read a little bit about in that Americo Paredes piece, the excerpt from With a Pistol in His Hand. He says, we see unrealistic ways in which cowboys are described. There was a deep ambivalence with these authors. They believed the main message, how the cowboy was a, quote, extraordinary man with an extraordinary code, true symbol of the virility and character of rugged individualism, but they were also taken in by that romanticized image, that romanticized myth. And the story, or the short novel that we began the class with, Shane, is very much an example of that romanticized myth of this kind of huge, heroic, symbolic character who has an extraordinary code. Now, this ambivalence is very important. To be ambivalent about something is to feel two ways about something, to have mixed feelings or contradictory feelings. Monk Murtry's Lonesome Dove series, and right here I have a picture of Augustus McCrae and Woodrow Call, the most famous Texas Rangers of all, from the Lonesome Dove series. This was very popular. The Lonesome Dove stories were very popular with both critics as well as lay audiences. And again, he made a long career about writing about these people. I've often, or maybe once or twice, talked about how I began my English career when I fell in love with Augustus McCrae and Woodrow Call. And I still love and admire the mythology that these men represent. But I also understand that they're phantoms. That they, like the image so many of us have of Texas Rangers, never really existed. They have metaphorical value, especially when we recall that myths are not falsehoods, but explanations. The exploits of the Texas Rangers, sometimes very dark, again, as we read in the excerpt from With the Pistol in His Hand, really have perpetuated certain images throughout history. So the idea of feeling two ways about something is very important to the revisionist Western. We understand the metaphoric value, we understand the mythic value of these symbols, but we also understand that there may not be a whole lot of truth to that image. Image is something that we in American culture have created. So to talk a little bit about postmodernism, and especially because we're talking about revisionist Westerns, films and stories that overturn or deconstruct some of the metaphors that we've been discussing up to now, are postmodern. So let's combine this idea of these early myths, these earlier stories, these traditional classic Westerns with a postmodern outlook. For instance, let's recall the short story that we read by Rebecca Roanhorse called Welcome to Your Authentic American Indian Experience. If you remember this story, this is a postmodern story about a Native American, and it's in the future, right, because it's a speculative story, who is so consumed by the created or maybe even false images about his own culture that he's witnessed throughout his lifetime. And it's a postmodern story because it illustrates how, when we tease apart those stereotypes of what constitutes Indianness, those aspects come out fairly false, right? They're constructions that American culture has created and imposed upon all Native Americans. So it's postmodern because everything that our protagonist, Jesse Turnblatt, thinks about his culture actually turns out to be pretty false. And in the end, he has no narrative footing to stand on. So the idea of postmodernism is that we lose faith in those institutions that at one time really defined who we were as Americans. What happens when we can't rely on the government to act on our behalf? What happens when a good education can only be had by some, or when the educational system or the military or healthcare becomes big business and prioritizes profits over people? Well, we can say that we become a little jaded, which again is part of that postmodern condition, but we can also say that these grand narratives, these big stories that have structured so much of our lives as Americans, have kind of lost their meaning. That is the postmodern condition. So again, what we're doing is we are deconstructing what's happening within these films. And to deconstruct means to take apart some piece. For us, it's parts of material culture, whether it's works of literature or films. But then we look at the structure. We take it apart to see how it's built, right? And so we see how classic Westerns, when we take apart a classic Western, we see how they're built on these kind of false binaries and maybe even some destructive patterns. So once again, let's do a little review while we talk a little bit about the revisionist Western. In classic Westerns, heroes and villains are depicted in strict binaries, black and white, good versus evil. Evil's always the other. Evil is always Indians or minority figures. Revisionist Westerns, which really come about post-World War II, by about 1950, but really a little further on even, may be told from the viewpoint of the other, right? Non-settler viewpoints, including Native Americans or women at the center. I just used the example of Welcome to Your Authentic Indian Experience. If we think of that as a Western, well, it's being told from the point of view of an American Indian, which already is revisionist. Also, there is very often a critique of the use of violence that promote these false ideals of manhood in these revisionist Westerns. So in these works also we find westward expansion sometimes is problematic, maybe even unjust. Chaos and violence might reign, as opposed to that orderly landscape in classic Westerns where good or white always triumphs over evil. And again, evil is anyone brown, black, Native American. Heroes or anti-heroes in the case of revisionist Westerns provide only temporary relief from dysfunction. And remember, these colonial issues, they might shift. These new colonizers often are associated with swelling or expanding industry, this capitalization of landscape, not by farmers or ranchers, but by corporations. And we're going to see this in a couple of the films that we talk about here. So let's jump into talking a little bit about these films and how these films that I've asked us to maybe take a look at are revisionist Westerns. For instance, True Grit, either the 2010 version, which I prefer, or the older John Wayne version, is a revisionist Western. To begin with, we've got a female protagonist, a young girl who is headstrong, who can outwit men in powerful positions, from bankers to U.S. Marshals to Texas Rangers. In this film, the Ranger, played by Matt Damon, is also seen as kind of a dandy. Not to mention that our U.S. Marshal, played by Jeff Bridges, is a drunk who seems to use some pretty unscrupulous methods when doing his job. Unforgiven is a very important film produced and directed by Clint Eastwood in 1992. It's perhaps one of the most important revisionist Westerns of our era because it popularized Westerns once again. It brought Westerns back to the film industry. We hadn't really seen Westerns for a couple of decades until Unforgiven was back in the studios. In other words, Westerns had taken a hiatus from the American imagination for a while, and it won a slew of awards, something a Western had not done in generations. And the important thing here is, again, and we'll talk about this, the idea that your hero is not very heroic, is not a guy that we generally want to look up to. He's actually a very troubled character, something that we'd never see in a classic Western, like Shame. No Country for Old Men, like Unforgiven, has aspects of the thriller Like Unforgiven, its theme is dark. Its outlook is dark and very violent. In this film, the landscape is haunted by a kind of ghost figure, the antagonist Anton Chigurh. In Unforgiven, our main character is haunted by his past deeds. He's a real killer who's killed lots of people, and this haunts him. We have a different kind of haunting in No Country for Old Men. Anton Chigurh, the antagonist, the evil aspect that, again, the U.S. Marshal is trying to hunt down, uses a bolt pistol to kill his prey, really dehumanizing his kills. At the heart of the film is a huge sum of money connected to a shadowy cartel as well as a shadowy American corporation. What's more, the hunter and the hunted blur in this film. And our good guy, Llewellyn Moss, played by Josh Brolin, is a thief, right? He commits a crime at the very beginning of the film, so already that puts him in a very peculiar position. That's not a heroic position. At the film's end, there's no justice. There's no closure. The old sheriff has seemingly lost his power, and the new power seems to be all about money, even if it's blood money. And that really makes things a lot worse. Hell or High Water from 2016 is a very different kind of film, but still a Western. And those of you that watch this probably thought, why are we watching this film? It's not really a Western. It's only until about half an hour in that you get the feel of a Western. It's radically different. It takes place in urban settings. And like in No Country, our old sheriff, here played by Jeff Bridges, doesn't seem to have the power or the insight needed to catch the bad guys. And at least one of these gets away in the end. The entire plot of the film surrounds how so many families were left destitute after the financial crisis of 2008. And our protagonists have little hope for a better future. And their extra legal methods for solving it seem to be a reflection of the destructive lengths to which a certain set of people, in this case, poor whites, would go to hold on to something they'd always felt was theirs. The U.S. Marshal in the film, again Jeff Bridges, is from a different time, just like the sheriff in No Country for Old Men. So one really important thing to kind of hold on to in the revisionist Western is the idea of the anti-hero. Traditional heroes are generally protagonists that are dignified, brave, idealistic. They have a purpose. Again, we might think of someone like Shane or even Alexandra Bergson from O Pioneers. It's easy to look up to these figures and admire them. Anti-heroes, which is what we have in the revisionist Western, are morally ambiguous. They may act as protagonist or antagonist, and they don't usually have qualities we admire. They may be self-interested, they may be weak, they may be cowardly, they may be alienated from society or otherwise unable to communicate with the wider world. They might even be psychopathic, like Anton Chigurh. Some of Jeff Bridges' Rooster Cogburn is a little sociopathic as well. Anti-heroes are oppositional in nature, and their failings may point to themselves, but also to the worlds that they inhabit. In this way, they provide an avenue for social and cultural as well as ethical critique. In other words, that shifting hero really can tell us a lot about the shifting values in American society. So the final slide on this PowerPoint is really an overview slide that kind of helps us get to the point of the revisionist Western. And there's lots of ways to approach this. But one way to approach it is to think about, well, what's happened to family values? What's happened to social values? We see those values deeply entrenched in in literature like Shane or even O Pioneers. So let's recall Shane's innate gentleness towards values associated with the homestead and his silent, inevitable deadliness towards anything that imperiled it. Contrast this with No Country for Old Men or Hell or High Water, right? Lots of violence. The family structure seems to have disintegrated somewhat. Look at the women. Marion in Shane is very happy in that domestic sphere. She's happy making apple pies. We have these very traditional metaphors, wholesome American life. Again, contrast this with the torn family in Hell or High Water, where divorce is, of course, part of the family that we're looking at, but also running rampant in society. Maybe even the female prostitutes in Unforgiven, or True Grit's Maddie Ross, right? Also, and finally, maybe the lawful livelihood of the nuclear family versus the ruthless entrepreneur. Let's contrast this with the illegally land-grabbing bank in Hell or High Water. In Hell or High Water, the antagonist, the bad guy, is the bank that has foreclosed illegally on this poor white family. The corrupt sheriff in Unforgiven, Little Bill Doggett. These are not men or patterns that we would like to emulate. So once again, revisionist Westerns, very different from classic Westerns, darker, more cynical. Maybe the family values that we see in classic Westerns, as well as those early metaphors, really begin to fall apart. And that falling apart signifies a kind of postmodern condition where we can no longer count on those institutions, just like we can no longer count on those heroes in the end to save us in the contemporary era. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon.